Thank you very much, Chris, and congratulations on getting everything right in the intro. Usually there's at least one mistake when I'm introduced, which always strikes me as odd because my bio is everywhere to be found in every organization I'm affiliated with. And as you said, I've just moved from RUSI to AI in Washington, and the reason I'm a visiting fellow is that, as the participants may know, there is a visa ban at the moment. Trump decided that he didn't want any more highly qualified people in the United States. So I'm waiting for my visa, but that is soon to be sorted. And I'm thrilled to be working on issues of new national security threats. And what are those threats, you may ask? Well, I think that the reason that BCS, your part of BCS, first contacted me was that I wrote an op-ed for Politico about a really unsavory event. It wasn't an event. It was news that had emerged about something that had been going on about for a long time, which was that a Chinese company, which turns out to have contracts with the government, had been collecting people's personal information that they had posted on social media, and specifically the data dump that was given to a researcher, which then made its way to various newspapers, was comprised around 2.5 million people in the West, in North America, and Europe and Australia and so forth. And specifics about their personal lives. And the crazy thing, also the frightening thing about it is, was that all of that information was had been taken from public sources. So this company that had collected information hadn't hacked into anybody's accounts. It was all things that could be found online if you look for it. And for me, that raises the question. So we live in a day and age where we share a lot online, and we put baby pictures online. We put pictures of our pets, of our streets, of our hobbies, and of our likes and dislikes. And that's fine, because that's how we communicate with one another in person. And what else are you going to talk about when you talk with others? You can't always talk about lofty political ideas. You have to talk about sort of daily life as well. And so we put that information online, even though I must say I've never put pictures of my children online, simply because I was afraid that criminals would be able to access them. I just hadn't thought of this information being used for geopolitical purposes, but that was exactly the case with this Chinese company. So the Chinese company in question refused to say anything about this data dump, but the reality is it had all this information, and it has contracts with the Chinese government, and it's unclear what else it could use the information for, because advertisers already get the information they need through contracts with the social media companies themselves. So what was even more frightening about this leak was that it contained information about many notable figures, so politicians, artists, but also quite a few military officers. And that, of course, is an alarm signal in itself, because why does a commercial company need information about a great number of officers in the US Armed Forces? There is no commercial reason for it at all. And so if we think about that, you can say, oh, that's an isolated incident, but that's just one way in which today we as ordinary citizens are being affected by the geopolitical standoff or confrontation between China and what we usually call the West, which is not the geographical West. It's liberal democracies, so European countries, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and so forth. that's why one way in which we're being affected, and even though nobody confirmed what this enormous data collection was for, it's clear that it was not for commercial purposes, and that's one way. Then we have all heard about disinformation over the previous years, and it's something that was well known in countries like the Baltic states. It was well known that Russia would try to interfere with them and to mess with their countries by spreading disinformation. But for us in countries that never existed, that were fortunate enough not to be part of the Warsaw Pact, we haven't really had any experience with disinformation. And so it wasn't really until 2016, the US elections 4 years ago, that most people realized that other countries may try to mess with our countries by spreading false information. And of course, since then, fake news has become a ubiquitous term. And it wasn't just in the US, it was obviously in the Brexit referendum as well. That was, spread of disinformation, not as extensive as in the US election, and in fact hasn't really been investigated yet. And it's not clear whether it had any impact on the election result itself. But what matters is that the disinformation is there, and that it convinces people that there is something wrong with their countries, because that is the purpose. The purpose is not to convince them to believe one thing or another. It's to confuse them and to make them feel that that institutions in their society can't be trusted anymore. And so that's something that people in the Baltic states have been living with for a long time, and that we in the so-called West, in the old West, are now having to learn how to live with. But that's not the only thing. And now I'm sounding terribly depressing here, but I think it's important for us ordinary citizens to have this conversation so that we are prepared, and that we know what's going on, and that we can better prepare ourselves. And so these sort of forms of interference are directed at ordinary people or affect ordinary people. Then, of course, we have what you all are concerned about, which is, of course, cyber aggression and cyber attacks. And that has been going on for a long time, has been discussed a lot. For me, the question is, who is responsible for keeping our countries safe? As we speak, the UK just has a new national cyber force, which I think is fantastic. So it means that now the UK government is much better equipped to hit back against those who attack both private companies and government structures within the UK. But we also, so that's a very blunt tool to use, because if we hit back, there is a risk that the other country will hit back against us, and it will escalate. So that again comes back to what should be expected of companies, what should be expected of ordinary citizens. So I think you all on this call remember when the O2 network went down a couple of years ago. I'm an O2 customer, and then I remember how incredibly annoying it was, because you don't realize how much you need the network until you don't have it. And so I had to take the train that day, and I couldn't remember when I got to the train station which train it was I had to take, and my phone didn't work, obviously, or the network didn't work. But so that was just a faulty switch somewhere, I think an update that went wrong. But what would happen if another country managed to bring down the network, either of one of the mobile providers or something more extensive? Would we as ordinary citizens be prepared? Would we know what to do? And I think, in fact, I'm convinced we wouldn't, if that one day, really half a day disruption, and only O2 customer disruption, if that's anything to go after. And I don't know how many of you remember when the power went down last year. I think it was for 15 minutes in large parts of the UK. And I remember in London, it it was quite chaotic. It wasn't as chaotic as news media reported afterwards, sort of with the reports of apocalyptic scenes. It wasn't that bad, but power went down. And so these are all things that can happen as a result of a mistake, but also as a result of hostile activity against our countries. And we have seen that both Russia and China are willing and able to conduct such attacks against our country. And the question is, will they be successful? And I think we have to assume that they will be successful. Iran and North Korea are, of course, likewise conducting cyber attacks. And I think it's important to remember with cyber attacks that, and you will all know this, that the purpose is not just to create disruption and to bring down the internet or power or whatever the internet enabled function is. It can also be to steal intellectual property, and that's something I'm greatly concerned about as well, which is the third area. And then I'll stop talking and we can have a conversation. But the third area I'm concerned about is what I call subversive business practices. So when other countries hack into our networks to steal, or hack into our companies' networks and indeed research institutions and government agencies to steal intellectual property to advance their own research. And we have seen it in the UK when there have been hacks of institutions conducting COVID vaccine research. And the point was obviously not to sort of just bring them down and let them struggle for 24 hours. The point was to get access to their intellectual property. And we've seen it for years, over and over again. Virtually every Western company has been affected by intellectual property theft, primarily by China. And so that again shows how national security is changing, or how national security threats are changing, because ordinarily in the past, companies didn't have to worry about national security threats. They went about their daily lives and did as well as they could on the commercial basis on which they operate. Today, it's different. They are targeted by national security threats, and that raises the question of what to do about it. Then another aspect of subversive business practices I think is really important. In fact, I just gave evidence to Parliament this afternoon, is acquisition or M&As, so all sorts of investments into our best companies. And it used to be that foreign entities from foreign countries came in and sort of invested in famous companies, and it was all part of globalization. And that's the way globalization is supposed to work. What's happening today is that China in particular, through Chinese companies, are investing in or acquiring our best startups with cutting edge technology. And yeah, I mean, they are free to do it. There is no legislation against it, no rules against it. But China is using that openness of our countries to gain access to our best technology and to strengthen China and weaken us. And they are primarily, well, they are extremely interested in dual use technology but all cutting edge technology from biotech to AI. So all of that is happening, and that raises the question for companies: what should we do? What can we do? And how can we protect ourselves against these forms of aggression? And that's what my research focuses on. And the point is that we aren't set up to defend ourselves. And the reason we aren't set up to defend ourselves against these threats is that for such a long time, national security threats were only about what another country's armed forces can do to our armed forces. And so we in the UK built, I'm Swedish originally, but it's the same thing in Sweden. Every country built up really good armed forces. The UK still has excellent armed forces, and as we know, the government has just invested another 16.5 billion into better capabilities for the armed forces, including a new national cyber force. But the point is that we are not set up to defend society against threats that are of a non-military nature. Yes, it's great that we are now building up this national cyber force, but that's just the offensive capability with which the MOD and GCHQ will be able to hit back against other countries. It's not the full answer. And we are not set up to defend ourselves against subversive business practices. We are not set up to defend ourselves against disinformation and sort of wholesale collection of people's data. What do we do about that? Who should do it? Who's responsible? Who should coordinate it? What should the responsibilities of us as citizens be? Do we have a responsibility, or should the government do everything? And if so, are we willing to abdicate that sort of role to the government, where the government will be able to do a whole lot in our names, but to do so, it would also require us to give up more freedom? I think the answer is for each and every one of us to do our part for national security, and that's something I work a lot on. What does it mean? What exactly should we do? And so, for example, something I've proposed is resilience training. I proposed it for teenagers, but it can be for people of any age. So the way I proposed it is that it should be for 3 weeks between this penultimate and last year of senior school, and it would be for open to all teenagers, but it would be voluntary. And you would, as part of this resilience training, it would take place on university campuses, taught by, for example, British Army officers, but not in the military capability, but seconded to the Home Office, for example, and they would teach crisis preparedness skills, crisis response skills, and others would teach information literacy. And after you finish the 3-week training, you would get the sort of certificate saying you have been trained, and it could also include, for example, UCAS points for those who are going to university, or tax credit for those who are going straight to the labor market after secondary school. The S&P has actually picked up on this proposal and is turning it into something called Resilience Scotland in Scotland, because resilience is a devolved responsibility. And so the way they are planning to set it up is that everybody should be able to get this resilience training, which I think, in hindsight, I think it's a brilliant idea. I should have thought of that myself. So the way they are seeing it is that it should be open to people of all ages. So if people between jobs, retired people, and so forth. That makes a lot of sense, because the message I want to get across is that we have incredible potential as in our societies, including the UK. It's just that we haven't been trained for contingencies or these sort of insidious threats, so we don't know what to do. And that's what we saw during the early weeks of COVID, that most of us struggled. We didn't know what to do. People stockpiled, and it was all quite chaotic. And COVID was, if you might call a benign crisis, because it was slow in the making, and we had a lot of time to prepare. In case of a devastating cyber attack, for example, we'll have no time to prepare. And so the bottom line is we have so many brilliant and even less brilliant people in our societies, and if we all prepare for contingencies and these sort of unsavory situations, then those situations and the people who try to weaken us are less likely to succeed. And so I see incredible potential, and it's fantastic that resilience, that Scotland is taking this idea of resilience forward. And by the way, I don't know how many people on this call have kids, but you'll remember something that David Cameron set up called the National Citizenship Service, and it was essentially a way to keep older teenagers entertained during the summer by, they could build little playground structures and so forth. But it was a program in search of a cause. And I think resilience it's something we need to develop, and it's something that we could teach to teenagers, because they realize when they are just being given something to do for the summer, and when they're given something important to learn. And if we did this, then we would have a critical mass of people, whether it be teenagers or a wider group of society, who would know what to do in a crisis, so that when the next crisis comes, we don't all run around like headless chickens, which is for what happens every time there is a power cut, and also every time there is a terrorist incident. And we should remember that that remains a threat. I remember, for example, the Westminster Bridge attack, when not a single person who sort of arrived at the scene or happened to be at the scene, and people crowded around, and as is now the habit, filmed it on their cameras rather than trying to help, because I hope my generous interpretation is true. They didn't know how to help. And so nothing happened until Tobias Ellwood turned up, MP, who happened to have been an officer in the army, and he knew first aid. My point is, we could all learn first aid. We could all learn these basic skills. And if we do that, so basic skills from first aid, to knowing what to do if power goes out, to knowing what to do if you have a startup and a mysterious entity comes and wants to invest in your company, to knowing what to do with your personal information on the internet. If we develop that resilience individually, then we are much better set up as a society to protect ourselves individually and our communities and the country. And so I'll stop there, because I promised Chris I would speak for 20 minutes. Now I've spoken for 23 minutes, and I want to leave time for discussion. But before that, I really wanted to bring across that I'm not pessimistic. I'm not sort of a doomsday sayer, pointing out everything that can go wrong. I think it's clear what can go wrong. What I want to bring across is that we have the capability and capacity, because we are all I don't want to say it doesn't have anything to do with education. Actually, we are all resourceful people, and we all know how to read and write, and that's all that's necessary to be able to better look after ourselves and our communities and families, and as a result, the country. So I'll end there, and happy to discuss. I don't like to call it Q&A, because it really is a discussion, I hope. So happy to answer any questions and discuss.
Thank you, Elisabeth. That's incredibly informative, and gives us a lot of pause for thought. I can tell there's a very clear sense of urgency behind the messages that you're putting forward to us this evening. It to some extent reminded me of the discussions in the Cold War about educating the public, managing the issues of the Cold War. What is it specifically inside you that is you feel needs to be driving the urgency, that it needs to be done now, not later?
Yeah, that's a good question. So during the Cold War, there was, as you said, there were lots of public awareness initiatives, and those who are a bit older will remember the nuclear drills, where school kids were told to hide underneath their school desks, which of course would have had no effect in case of a nuclear strike. But at least the idea was that you educate the population, and so that they feel at least somewhat prepared in emergency. But the reality was, during the Cold War, yes, I mean, it was there was a risk that the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies would invade the UK. There was an even bigger risk that they would invade Finland and indeed my home country of Sweden and of course West Germany. But still, there was a risk that would happen, that existed in all countries. But for most countries, including the UK, that risk was not particularly big. And so it was, of course, prudent to practice and to involve the population in practicing for such an eventuality, but it wasn't a likely scenario. Of course, you should practice for unlikely scenarios as well. What has changed is that today the forms of aggression against our societies, that's not a sort of something that may happen. It's already happening every single day, and I think that's the challenge is that in isolation, each incident seems small. Right? It doesn't seem like it's worth so worrying about, and what's one poisoning of one Russian agent in Salisbury doesn't really mean anything, and what's one cyber attack, what's a bit of intellectual property theft, and what's some disinformation. But in combination, it's actually extremely destabilizing to our societies, and we're already seeing it, for example, when it comes to disinformation. I think 2 years ago there was a survey. Was it last year? A survey here in the UK about election security, and half of the people surveyed thought that the Brexit vote had been compromised by Russia, and half thought that they had not. But the fact that half of the population thought that vote was somehow tainted or not wasn't carried out, didn't come through correctly, I think is incredibly damaging, because if we can't trust our elections, I mean that is, elections are the pillar of our modern democracies, of our liberal democracies. If we can't trust those, then we are on very unstable ground. And so I think it's in everybody's interest to keep our elections safe and to keep everything else safe. And so long answer to your excellent question. The reason I'm so concerned is that all of this is happening now, and maybe because each incident seems so small, or maybe not worth taking seriously, we are a bit complacent about it. And just one more point on that. So it's called salami as a tactic, as you know, and China has used it to incredible effect in the South China Sea. So a few years ago, it started building structures in a disputed part of the South China Sea that's also claimed by other countries, but there was no land there, it was just water. So China started putting some structures in the water, and the other countries didn't really see a reason to do anything about it, because it was just China putting a bit of some structures in the water. Well, that continued incrementally, and now China has islands in the South China Sea. You will have read about it. And not only does it have islands, it has military installations on those islands. It has changed the reality, not by going to war with anybody. It has changed the reality, has gained territory, not by going to war with anybody, in which case the countries, the countries affected would have responded and the US would have helped them. But it has changed the reality and gained territory by using this incremental method or strategy, which I think really illustrates why it's so damaging.
So Pat asks a follow-up question related to that, and he says that given that the sort of average assumable literacy age in the UK is that of a 9-year-old, he feels that getting the message out about what you're advocating might be difficult, particularly targeting it at the right level. And given that we as a British Computing Society, IT may come across very naturally to us, but we're not necessarily reflective of the wider population. So how can you achieve the messaging that you're looking for in the language that and level of impetus that actually will make the right effect?
That is an excellent question. Yeah. So at which level should the instruction be delivered, and how can you know that level of instruction? Who does it work for? So the way they want to do it in Scotland, if the manifesto is if the SNP is re-elected and if the manifesto is implemented, I think is that there will be different levels of instruction for whoever signs up. But short of that, because it requires the government delivering and sort of setting up the program, I think short of that, the way to do it is through workplaces. And so companies could be incentivized to train their own staff, and they would get tax credit for doing so. And then because they obviously know their own employees very well, they would be able to deliver it at different levels and also measure effect and test them as a sort of an exit test. But it is a really good question because, as your colleague pointed out, we have hugely different information literacy skills, computer literacy skills, and something that seems completely obvious to this group may seem completely incomprehensible to somebody like me because I'm not a computer expert, and will seem even more incomprehensible to older people who haven't grown up obviously with computers. And we should remember that old people are often particularly vulnerable to disinformation and indeed to various insidious computer forms of internet aggression, for example, where they are tricked into giving money away. So it is an excellent question. I think the best answer is through employers. But another idea is to build on the old sort of societies that have in the past been pillars of different communities. The Red Cross is not a good example, but community organizations like that. And I think actually this could be a good opportunity also for people to come together. One of the biggest problems that we have in our society, and especially now during COVID, but obviously it will, even COVID will end. But one of the biggest problems we have is the fragmentation of our society, is the fact that we don't interact, and that in fact atomization, where we all live alone and we hardly interact with our neighbors or indeed anybody else except maybe the people we work with. And I think if community organizations were to be tasked to deliver a curriculum like this, maybe starting at a sort of a lowest common denominator, it could bring people together, get them interested in keeping their communities safe, and also get them to interact with one another.
Mm-hmm. Pat also asks, are you aware of Friends Against Scams, which is a UK organisation that tackles learning and information awareness over online scams, telemarketing scams and that sort of thing? He's suggesting it as a model that potentially could be useful to disseminate this type of message.
Yeah, no, it's a really good idea. I wasn't aware of it, but see, so that's why I think we have incredible potential. We're not just sort of, mindless human beings who are a burden to society. We are a resource to society if we get this sort of basic level of knowledge, and I think maybe the ones among us who are already more knowledgeable, it could be an opportunity for them, including the organization you just mentioned, to do a fantastic service for society. And I think even it could even be reimbursed by the government. I know the Cabinet Office is thinking very hard about how to get these messages out, and they've had me in several times to talk about what can be done, and then they always ask, well, how do we get the message out? And maybe community organizations like what you just mentioned are a useful one of the most useful venues for that.
What do you think perhaps our role is, because the BCS being the Chartered Institute for IT and effectively the governing body of IT in the UK, as well as having influence with Parliamentary Select Committee and the parliamentary process? We have significant impact and influence in training that goes on, particularly in higher education. Do you think the BCS should be leading in this process? And if so, what could you see our actual value is in the process?
I think it could play a fantastic role. And so the way I understand the BCS is that it's essentially a body representing IT professionals vis-a-vis the government. But what if it were to represent you vis-a-vis wider society, where you were to share your expertise at admittedly a very fundamental, a very sort of rudimentary level with other people? I think it could have a phenomenal impact, and it wouldn't even have to be in person. It could be if you were to put together instructional videos for schools to use, or for vocational colleges to use, or for further education colleges. That could be a fantastic resource, because the sort of threats I'm talking about, it's not news to anybody. We all hear about disinformation. We all hear about, we should worry about threats on the internet. But if you don't have anybody tell you what to do about it, then how are you going to be a part of the solution? And for example, I've done so many tests where you test yourself whether you can spot a fake social media profile, and even after having done all those tests, I don't always get it right. And I'm not claiming I'm the genius on fake social media profiles, but I think I've got a good level of awareness. But for people who haven't done it, I mean, how are they supposed to know? I mean, they can hear all day long that they should be aware, but how are you aware if you don't know what to look for? So I think the BCS could play a phenomenal role. And I'm not saying you should spend all your free time delivering expertise to the rest of the country, but it could be something where where you make a huge difference for the rest of the country, even maybe just by doing something relatively minor.
There's definitely part of the issue with it is that we're so used to thinking about information we receive on the web page as being authoritative. It's something that's put in front of us, and there's an assumption that it's been vetted. There's an assumption that some higher authority has done that, because the origins of the World Wide Web came out of higher education and academia. We're used to typing something into Google, into a search engine, and it giving us an authoritative answer. Social media psychologically has changed that dynamic. So, like you say, it does become very difficult for people to ascertain right from wrong, fake from not. So, I mean, particularly with various recent scandals, the US election, 2016 election, and that sort of thing. Paolo's asking, do you think we actually have any protection against political manipulation, beg your pardon, for example, with Brexit and the Donald Trump issue? Do we have anything at all, or are we in the Wild West at the moment?
We don't. The only thing we have at the moment is whatever self-policing mechanisms the social media networks put in. And I have to say, in the previous life, I was a technology correspondent. I was based in San Francisco for 5 years, and this was in 2004 to 2009. And I constantly went around to startups, and it was always the same sort of scene. A few guys, a foosball table, if you know what those are, standard equipment in any startup office in the San Francisco area, and a few guys at a few desks and this football table, and most of the ideas were pretty pedestrian. I mean, there was one company that had invented a new inbox. There was one company that had invented a new parking app, lots of things like that. Most of them didn't make it. A few made it. And one of the companies that made it was Twitter. I went to visit them when there was just 10 guys, and you emailed info@twitter.com, and they were in a warehouse in San Francisco, and you emailed them. And one of the founders emailed back. So in my case, Biz Stone, who was one of the founders, he emailed back when you emailed that general address. And so you went to see him. I went to see him, and we had a nice chat. And that was it. I mean, I didn't see the business model of Twitter then. I still don't see it, but I'm clearly wrong. But the point is, Twitter, which is now, it was founded in 2006, it's now 14 years old, is an absolute pillar of the way the world operates today. It's the way in which the president of the United States communicates with the world. It's how politics is carried out in many ways. And I don't know if you saw, this was 2 days ago, the EU defense ministers were having a meeting, and as we all know, politicians today feel that they have to be relevant and sort of communicate with the public. So they often put on Twitter what sort of meeting they have coming up. And the Dutch defense minister put on Twitter that he was going to attend, as they all write, looking forward to attending such and such meeting. And they posted a screenshot of the meeting invitation, but he didn't realize that he put the login details. I'm sure you all saw it. And so the point is, there is, if you make a mistake like this, and as you all know, a Dutch journalist managed to log in. But I think it just illustrates the way in which we live today, that, yeah, if you want to join, if you want to try to guess that final digit of the pin and get into the meeting, you can, which is what that Dutch journalist did. And there's nobody to stop you, because it's not Twitter's responsibility to stop the Dutch defense minister from putting the information online. It's not Twitter's responsibility to help protect that information once it is online. So who is responsible? Only the social media networks, and they are not government agencies. Their only obligation is to their shareholders. So I think that's where the disconnect is today, that so much of such great importance is being conducted in arenas where there are no rules, really, and it's unclear who's responsible for the well-being of society, which is why we have had such problems, including the ill-fated US election in 2016, where it became painfully clear that Russia had exploited that openness.
May I ask, Elisabeth, do you use social media yourself?
So I use Twitter because I'm told I have to. So I have a Facebook account. Simply so that my name doesn't get taken by anybody else. But I don't use it, and the reason I don't use it is actually a political one. I think Facebook played a very damaging role in the last US election, and has played a damaging role in our societies beyond that. And I don't want to help them make more money by giving them my personal details. So because that's how they make money, right? I mean, the more we use Facebook, the more data they have to sell.
Do you, on a personal level, believe that there's actually a safe balance with people using social media and those sorts of platforms, or do you think it is just an absolute minefield that people shouldn't be getting into?
Well, I think there is a relatively safe level. Obviously, if you don't put any personal information about yourself. Then another thing is that it's very politically poisonous, right? I mean, we all should be having conversations like this rather than having conversations on Twitter, because conversations on Twitter will lead nowhere. And that's my concern, that it's so easy to sit on Twitter and shout at one another, and we have seen the level of discourse over the past few years. It's depressing when you think about when you consider the level of the education of the people who engage in it. I mean, I'm not saying better educated people are or should be more polite. I think we should all be polite, but those who consider themselves expert, the kind of mudslinging they engage in on social media, and especially Twitter, is really quite depressing. And I think it goes back to the point that we don't take our responsibility for democracy seriously. We think that it will always be around, that our standard of living, our conveniences will always be around. They won't always be around. We all have to do our part for society, right? And whether that is helping keep discourse civilized, or whether it is knowing what to do in case of a pandemic or in case of a cyber attack, I think if we sort of internalize that and remember that there's nothing that we can take for granted about our way of life today, then I think we hope we appreciate it more and are more willing to do our little bit, which is frankly not very much at all. No, and I don't know if you or the other participants, if you've seen the public awareness video, the two videos the German government put out about COVID. Otherwise, I'm happy to send them to you afterwards, and you can send them on to everybody else. Fantastic videos that really drive home the fact that what we are being asked to do during this coronavirus crisis, and indeed one could make the case in other crises as well, is not very much if you compare it to what our grandparents went through during the war.
I'll certainly ask you for those links, and we'll put them in the chat for anybody that wants them. Edmar24 asks, is it fair to say that maybe we need something similar to the Geneva Convention in the cyberspace?
Oh, we definitely do, and I know there are constant diplomatic efforts underway to establish something like that, and has been happening for years. And the problem is that it's well, we need something like the Geneva Conventions, and we also need something like the START treaties and the NPT. Well, the START treaties that regulate the number of nuclear weapons a country can have. So that was a treaty signed by the United States and the Soviet Union, and United States and Russia. But the problem is that conventional weapons and conventional violence is so much easier to quantify than social media violence or aggression, and so it's much easier for countries to hide and not want to commit, which is why we are stuck. And I know Microsoft is leading one effort, and power to them for trying to do something, but it's just so hard to quantify, and nobody wants to go first. So I think we can't hope that governments will solve this. It really comes down to us ordinary citizens doing our part. And I think if we look at the state of US discourse at the moment, I don't think that's that's anything we'd want to replicate in the UK. And I hope it's a wake-up call for all of us that we have to take democracy seriously, because otherwise it will get into a situation that is extremely ugly, and that will be difficult to get out of. Because even though it now looks like Joe Biden's transition will be happening, America is deeply divided, and the reason it's deeply divided is that the discourse has been so poisonous now for years, and fed by disinformation. And because people haven't been taking the risk of disinformation seriously, they've been spreading it because of who has time to look something up before they share it. And by the way, isn't such and such video hilarious? Well, it may be hilarious, but it's also it's also incorrect.
What would you say is the most important series of steps that the governments could put into place? You've mentioned, obviously, regulatory matters for social media companies, and you've mentioned training. But if you were in front of a select committee now and they asked you for the top 3 things that they should be doing right now, what would you say?
Well, the most important thing is that I would want to see, I know it would be very difficult, is a change in the curriculum. So, for example, Latvia, which is a country that has had a lot of experience with disinformation and other forms of non-military aggression, they recently introduced a new curriculum where all kids in what they call 10th and 11th grade, which is when they are 16 and 17, where they learn resilience. And so they learn about disinformation, they learn about threats against Latvia, they learn how to live daily life without, if in the internet and power should go down. So they learn how to navigate using a map. I mean, so things like, 20 years, 30 years ago, that was standard. And now in fact, it would be interesting to know how many people on this call know how to navigate using a map and a compass. I know I learned it, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be able to do it anymore. But they learn things like that, and so I think it's good to learn these skills, but it also drives home the point that you can't take the conveniences for granted. So that's something I would love to see. And on top of what it does for every kid, it also, of course, I shouldn't say kid, teenager, it also, of course, helps them understand, helps them appreciate the threats that face the country, and establishes this sort of critical mass of people who know what to do. Then another thing I would love to see is for the government to create some sort of standing consultations with business leaders, so that, and in fact, I can send over an article that for the participants it was just published. So business leaders and businesses obviously have an interest in making any disruption as limited as possible. But at the moment, businesses are on their own. They do crisis management training, and that training is, I mean, it's fine, but it's related to crises involving only their companies, because how else would they train for crises? But I think what's needed is for that to be much wider. For the government to engage with business leaders so they know what to do in case of a crisis that has nothing to do with a particular company, where the company just happens to be in the line of fire, as it were, of cyber fire or of other non-military aggression by another country. So that's something that it would not be difficult to do, and it wouldn't require any legislation. A change to the curriculum would require a change in legislation, which I'm told would be very difficult. But this sort of engagement with business leaders is so important, and it's in everybody's interest to make that happen.
Should it be mandatory at board level? So, for example, you've mentioned training many times at GCSE and A level type of ages, but should it become a mandatory part of board level, corporation level, actually demonstrating compliance, just like with the Data Protection Act and other such regulation?
That is an excellent question. So the way I've thought about it is that it could become, if you think about it, you remember, you and the others will all remember corporate social responsibility, and so I think of it as corporate national responsibility. So if companies demonstrate to their shareholders that they have done the utmost, or they can demonstrate what they've done to keep their company safe from these new threats, then that's something they can put in their annual report and obviously report to their shareholders. And it's something that gives them credibility with our shareholders and with potential shareholders. Whereas if you haven't done anything, then you don't have anything to put in your annual report. And shareholders will think about, is this a company worth investing in? If they are not prepared for these sort of challenges, that can be hugely devastating. We should remember that when you all remember NotPetya 3 years ago, I would think, yeah. And if we look at the losses that were incurred by the companies that were affected, Maersk $300 million, Merck $800 million, and Mondelez, I think, was it $800 million as well, dollars. I mean, these are enormous sums, and if you can't demonstrate to your shareholders that you have taken all possible precautions against it, then they will be uneasy about investing, because we have to remember these sort of attacks, if they are attributed to hostile state, it's very likely that insurance won't cover it, because it will be considered an act of war. So the escape clause or the exemption clause in the insurance policy will kick in, and so these companies really stand to lose a lot of money. And for example, Maersk has made a point of demonstrating exactly what it's doing now to keep its IT safe, and has been very public about what happened to it. But the point is, it can now show what it's doing, and that reassures shareholders.
And presumably it's also sort of citizen empowerment, because we as shareholders, we can encourage boards and companies through AGMs to actually start implementing this type of thing. So it works both ways as well. A question from Professor Kragelort. Do you think extreme political polarization in the current climate will allow for people to fight disinformation on their own without any government intervention?
That is an excellent question. Yeah. So, and this is why we don't want to become like America, because if you can't even agree on what constitutes a fact, then where do you start fighting disinformation? And America has such. And I'm saying this not having yet moved to America, but I'll start saying we in America when I received my visa. But it is a devastating effect that has been caused by disinformation and by the different sides' reluctance to agree that at least discuss on the basis of fact. And if we don't have that, how can we possibly keep our country safe from disinformation? So, yeah, I don't have an answer to the question. The only thing I hope is that if we start early in schools by drilling into our teenagers the value of facts, that they will take care to look after them, and at least as much as they may disagree, at least they'll have at the back of their heads that they shouldn't dispute facts, because otherwise we will cause enormous trouble for ourselves, or enormous problems for ourselves, and it will be a cakewalk for our rivals to cause even more harm to our countries. And I think it's very telling that in this round in this latest U.S. election, Russia was barely present. And why was that? They didn't need to do anything. I mean, it was Americans were doing the harm themselves by attacking one another, by spreading disinformation about one another or misinformation about one another. So Russia didn't need to do very much at all. So sorry to give you such a depressing answer.
Unfortunately, that's the way of the world these days, and depressing answers often lead to solutions and people fighting for change. So hopefully that's a positive thing.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's a good, if anything good can come out of the U.S. Election and in these past 4 years in America, is that the rest of us have seen what incredible damage poisoned discourse can cause, and I think it's a wake-up call for all of us to make sure that that doesn't happen in our countries.
Absolutely, yes. Well, unfortunately, we do still have questions coming, and I have many more myself, but we are pretty much out of time at the top of the hour now. So all that remains for me to do is to thank very kindly Elisabeth Braw for your time this evening, your insights and your experiences. And we do hope that Parliament continues to listen to you, and that your work with the AEI continues to deliver successful change in the Western world. So on behalf of myself from the Committee of BCS Hertfordshire, all that remains for me to say is, if you haven't already, please do click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to receive alerts from us. Please join us on our social media channels. More information can be found on hearts.bcs.org. And that remains for me to say is to you, good night.